What would you do if the man you loved, the man you gave 7 years of your life to, called you from a restaurant you had never been invited to and told you he had fallen in love with your sister? Not a stranger, not a coworker, your sister Camille, who borrowed your lip gloss and cried on your shoulder and stood in your childhood bedroom telling you she was so happy for you when you got engaged. That was the phone call that ended my old life. And this is the story of how I walked into their wedding on the arm of the most dangerous man alive, looked my ex-fiancée directly in the eye across a rose-covered altar, and watched every drop of color drain from his face. My name is Nadia Voss. I am a size 18. I can read a balance sheet faster than most men can read a menu. And 6 months ago, I was the kind of woman people looked through instead of at. I want you to understand how thoroughly I had been erased before I tell you how magnificently I came back. I want you to understand the specific texture of that erasure, the way it happens gradually and then all at once, the way you stop noticing you are disappearing until you catch yourself reflected in a window and don't recognize the shape of the woman looking back. Marcus Hale and I met at a company retreat in the Berkshires when I was 24. He was charming in that specific, practiced way that men who have been handsome their whole lives learn to be charming, effortlessly, without real cost, because it has never cost them anything. He laughed at my jokes. He held my hand in public. He told me I was brilliant, and I believed him, because brilliant had always been the word people reached for when they ran out of prettier words to say about me. We were engaged for 11 months. I planned most of the wedding myself. I chose the venue. I chose the flowers. I chose the menu. I lost 17 pounds before I gave them back, because Marcus had mentioned gently that the photographer they booked was not great at flattering certain figure types, and maybe I might feel more comfortable in the photos if I worked on that. I starved myself, and I thanked him for the suggestion, and I wore a sample-size engagement ring on my hand, like a trophy. And then, one Thursday evening in March, while I was sitting at my kitchen table reviewing our seating chart, my phone rang, and the man I was going to marry told me that he was in love with someone else. He said it had not been planned. He said it had crept up on him. He said he hoped I would understand. His voice was calm and reasonable and very slightly bored, the way people sound when they are delivering news they have rehearsed. I asked him who it was. He paused for exactly 4 seconds. Then he said her name. Camille. My sister's name, in my fiancé's voice, on a Thursday evening in March, while our seating chart sat open on my kitchen table with both of their names on it. I did not scream. I did not cry. I sat very still for a long time, and then I closed the laptop, and then I walked to the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror for what felt like an hour. I studied the face of a woman who had shrunk herself in every possible direction, her body, her opinions, her appetite, her presence, and had still not been enough. My mother called me 2 days later. She said she hoped I would find it in my heart to be happy for them. My father said these things happened. My aunts at a Sunday dinner I made the catastrophic mistake of attending, spoke around me in low voices, and cut their eyes at me with something that looked disturbingly like relief, as if a difficult situation had finally resolved itself in the most logical way. Camille did not call me at all. She sent a text. It said, "I'm sorry, Nadia. I hope you know I love you." I did not respond. I moved out of the apartment Marcus and I had shared into a studio on the 14th floor of a building in the Meridian district with windows that faced east and a kitchen so small I could touch both walls if I stretched my arms out. I went back to work. I ate what I wanted. I stopped counting. I stopped shrinking. I started sleeping properly for the first time in years because the particular exhaustion of managing another person's comfort with your own existence had finally lifted. And I was doing fine, genuinely, quietly fine, until the invitation arrived. It came in a cream envelope with gold foil lettering, addressed to Miss Nadia Voss in my mother's handwriting. Because my mother had, apparently, decided that the gracious thing to do was to invite me to watch the man I had nearly married exchange vows with my sister in the ballroom of the Ashworth Grand Hotel on the 22nd of September. The invitation was thick, expensive cardstock. The flowers on the front were peonies, which had been my choice for my own wedding. I sat with that envelope in my hands for 11 minutes. Then I put it on my kitchen counter, and I went to the window, and I looked out over the Meridian District, and I thought, carefully and clearly, about what I wanted to do. What I wanted, I realized, was not to decline. What I wanted was not to stay home and order takeout and let them have the narrative of the gracious ex who bowed out quietly. What I wanted was to walk into that ballroom and make every single person in it understand, permanently and without ambiguity, exactly what Marcus Hale had thrown away. The problem was that I could not do that alone. Walking in alone, in a nice dress, would read as desperate. I needed an equalizer. I needed something so far beyond anything Marcus Hale had ever touched that the comparison would not simply sting. It would destroy him. I did not have a plan. I had a wish. And then, 10 days before the wedding, I met Enzo Marcello, and the wish became something else entirely. I was not supposed to be at the Callaway Club that night. My colleague Priya had dragged me there for a work drinks thing I had agreed to mostly, so I would stop sitting in my apartment rereading the invitation. The Callaway Club was exactly the kind of place I had never belonged to and never pretended to. Dark wood paneling, amber light, booths that cost more per hour than some people's daily wages, a clientele that wore watches instead of jewelry, because in their world a watch was the jewelry. I was standing at the bar in a burgundy wrap dress I had bought on a Wednesday afternoon impulsively because it fit me exactly as I was, not as I had been told I should be, and I was waiting for Priya to come back from the bathroom when the man 2 seats down said something I was not supposed to hear. He was large and self-satisfied, and he had been watching me since I sat down with the particular expression of a man who has decided to be interested and expects that to be sufficient. He leaned toward his companion and said, in a voice that was not quite quiet enough, that it was impressive what they were letting into the Callaway these days. I felt the words land. I had felt words like them land my entire life. I had learned very young to absorb them and say nothing, because saying something made it worse, and saying nothing at least let you keep your dignity. But before I could do anything, before I could breathe, before I could decide what version of invisible I was going to be, the man at the far end of the bar looked up. I had not noticed him before. That is the first thing I want you to understand about Enzo Marcello. You did not notice him until he allowed you to. He was perhaps 40, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and the kind of face that belonged on old money portraits. Angular and austere, and completely, absolutely certain of itself. He was not large the way the other man was large. He was still in the specific way that very dangerous things are still. He set down his glass. He looked at the man who had spoken. He said very quietly, "Apologize to the woman. Not ask. Not suggest. Apologize." The man laughed, nervous and defensive. Enzo Marcello said nothing else. He simply held his gaze, and something about the quality of his silence, its absolute, unhurried certainty, made the other man's laugh die in his throat. The apology came in a mumbled, fumbling rush. Enzo Marcello nodded once, as though filing it away, then turned to me and said, "I am sorry you had to hear that." I said it was not his responsibility to apologize for other people. He said, "In my city, it is." He slid a card across the bar. It had a phone number and no name. He left before Priya came back from the bathroom. I put the card in my bag. I told myself I would throw it away in the morning. I did not throw it away in the morning. I called the number 3 days later. I called it because Priya, who knew everything about everyone in this city, the way only certain PR women do, had told me who he was, Enzo Marcello. The Iron Sovereign. They called him in certain rooms. He controlled the import trade in the Meridian and the harbor districts. He owned 4 legitimate businesses and a number of illegitimate ones that no prosecutor had ever managed to touch. He had testified before the city council twice and walked away both times without so much as an uncomfortable question. He was, Priya said, the most powerful and the most feared man in the city, possibly in the state. He had never married. He was not, as far as anyone knew, interested in being known. I called the number and he answered on the second ring, and I said, "I have a proposal for you." He was silent long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, "Tell me." So I told him. I told him about Marcus. I told him about Camille. I told him about the invitation on my kitchen counter with the peonies I had chosen and the date that had once been supposed to be my day. I told him what I wanted, to walk into that wedding on his arm and let everyone in that ballroom understand what they had underestimated. I expected negotiation. I expected conditions. I expected the kind of transactional calculation that men like him were rumored to apply to everything. He said, "I'll send a car for you on Friday. We'll discuss the details over dinner." And that was how it began. The dinner was at a restaurant called Sable, on the 42nd floor of a building I had walked past 100 times without knowing what was inside it. Because you could only get a table at Sable if you were called, never if you asked. He was already seated when I arrived. He stood when I walked in. Men like Marcus had stopped doing that around the 6th month. Enzo Marcello did it like it was the only reasonable response to a woman entering a room. We sat. He ordered wine without looking at the list, a 2009 Barolo that arrived with a deference from the sommelier that told me everything I needed to know about how this man was treated in every room he entered. He did not make me justify my plan. He did not make me shrink it or qualify it or apologize for wanting it. He listened with the full, unblinking attention of someone to whom other people's business was always professionally relevant. And when I finished, he said, "Your ex is a small man. Small men always underestimate." Then he said, "I'll need to understand the room. Tell me who will be there." So I told him. His family, my family, their work colleagues, the people who had looked through me for years and would be sitting in that ballroom expecting to feel comfortable. He listened. He asked 3 precise questions. Then he said, "We go on the 22nd. Wear something that makes you feel like what you are." I asked what that was. He looked at me across the table with an expression I had not seen on a man's face in a very long time, something between calculation and conviction, and said, "A queen who has been waiting for the right moment." I went home that night and sat in my kitchen and felt for the first time in 6 months like my own body was somewhere I could live. The week before the wedding, a black car arrived outside my building at 9 in the morning and did not leave until 7 in the evening. Inside was Enzo Marcello's personal stylist, a severe and magnificent woman named Suki, who spoke in assessments rather than suggestions, and who spent the first 40 minutes simply looking at me with the focused intensity of an architect studying a site she has been asked to transform. She did not tell me to lose weight. She did not hold garments against me and wince. She took measurements with a tenderness that felt almost reverent, and she said, "You have been dressed for camouflage your entire life. We are going to dress you for arrival." What she built for me over the next 7 days was a gown from the Milanese atelier Ferrante e Brio, custom fitted to every curve and fold of my body, in a deep emerald silk that moved like water and caught light like a second skin. It was not a dress designed to minimize. It was a dress designed to announce. The neckline was low enough to be deliberate and high enough to be devastating. The waist was fitted to exactly where my waist was, not where someone thought it should be. The skirt was full and swept the floor with a 3-inch train that whispered against marble when I walked. Suki paired it with earrings from the Venetian house of Cortese. Pear-cut Colombian emeralds set in white gold, $47,000 hanging from my ears like punctuation marks. My hair was done by a man named Luca, who worked exclusively in film, and he built it into something architectural and soft at once, like a structure that looked effortless because its engineering was perfect. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my studio on the morning of the 22nd of September, and I did not recognize myself. And then I looked longer, and I realized I did. I recognized the woman I had been before I learned to disappear. She had been here the whole time, waiting under 17 pounds of apology and 7 years of acceptable. The car arrived at 11. Enzo Marcello stepped out first. He was wearing a charcoal suit that had been made for him, with the same bespoke certainty as my gown. Brioni, I would learn later, a double-breasted cut that made him look like every powerful man from every era distilled into one. He looked at me standing in the doorway of my building. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There she is." That was all. But the way he said it, with the settled, certain satisfaction of a man who has just confirmed something he already knew, made my chest do something it had not done in a long time. The Ashworth Grand Hotel had a main entrance on the boulevard, flanked by limestone columns and 2 doormen in white gloves. And when the car stopped at the bottom of the steps, the doors opened, and the doormen moved, and the people on the steps turned, because a car like that arriving in front of a place like that was its own announcement. Enzo Marcello came around to my side of the car himself. He offered his arm. I took it. We walked up the steps, and I want to be very precise about what happened, because I want you to feel it the way I felt it. The doors opened, and the sound changed. Not silence exactly. The wedding guests inside the grand foyer were talking and moving and doing what people do at weddings before the ceremony begins. But the sound shifted, rippled, redirected, the way it does when something enters a room that requires a recalibration of attention. Heads turned and turned again. I saw my Aunt Petra first. Her glass stopped halfway to her lips. I saw my mother, standing near the floral installation that had been my idea, wearing a sapphire dress I had never seen, and her face went through 4 expressions in the span of 1 second. Surprise, confusion, calculation, something that looked briefly like shame. I saw Marcus's colleagues from Alderman Financial, men who had looked past me at every company event for 3 years, standing in a cluster near the champagne table, and one by one they turned, and one by one their faces did what faces do when they realize that the landscape has changed entirely and they do not know how. And then I saw Marcus. He was standing near the archway that led to the ceremony room, in his wedding suit, talking to his best man. He heard the shift in the room before he saw its cause. I watched it happen, watched him register that something had changed in the temperature of the space, watched him turn. And then he saw me. He saw me on the arm of Enzo Marcello. He saw the emerald gown and the Cortese earrings and the way I was holding myself, not curved inward and apologetic, but straight and present and completely, absolutely there. And I watched Marcus Hale's face do something I had spent 6 months imagining and had never quite believed would be real. It fell, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone else in the room would necessarily notice. But I noticed. I had spent 7 years learning the architecture of that face, and I saw every support beam crack at once. We took our seats in the 3rd row, center, the seats that Enzo Marcello's man had reserved under a name no one at the venue had thought to question, because no one at the venue questioned anything connected to that name. I sat with my back straight and my hands in my lap, and my emerald skirt pooled around me like a statement. Enzo Marcello sat beside me with the casual authority of a man who sits wherever he chooses and assumes the furniture is grateful. The ceremony began. Camille appeared at the back of the aisle in a dress that was beautiful, genuinely beautiful, ivory silk with a cathedral train and pearl buttons up the back, and I felt something when I saw her. Not grief exactly, not anger exactly, something older and more complicated that I had made a decision to set down and had mostly succeeded. I watched her walk up the aisle on our father's arm. I watched our father, who had told me these things happened, hand her to Marcus with an expression of uncomplicated joy. I watched the officiant begin. And I sat beside the most feared man in the city, and I breathed slowly and completely. And I felt the peculiar peace of a woman who has already won and is simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Marcus kept looking at me. I know because I could feel it, that specific pressure of someone else's gaze on the side of your face. But I did not look back. I watched the ceremony with polite, pleasant attention, and I ate a bread roll from the basket on the welcome table that someone had set out near our row, unhurriedly and with genuine enjoyment, because I was hungry and the bread was good, and there was no longer any person in my life whose discomfort with my appetite was my problem to manage. At the reception afterward, Enzo Marcello kept his hand at the small of my back and spoke to the people who approached him. And people approached him constantly, with the jittery deference of those who understand they are in the presence of something significant, with a measured warmth that made very clear I was the axis the evening turned on. He introduced me twice as Nadia, who is the reason I am here. Not his date, the reason. People processed that sentence, and their eyes moved to me and recalibrated, visibly, as though they were scrolling back through their memory of every time they had looked past me and feeling the full retroactive weight of that error. Marcus found me near the Champagne station at 8:17. I know the time because I had glanced at my watch 30 seconds before. The Cartier piece Enzo Marcello had clasped around my wrist that morning with the quiet certainty of a man who gives gifts the way he gives orders, simply, without requiring acknowledgement. Marcus came alone. His tie was loosened by one half-turn, the specific degree of dishevelment that men deploy when they want to seem emotional without losing control. He said my name. I turned. His eyes moved over me the way they never had when we were together, with a hunger that was also a reckoning, the look of a man who has just understood the full cost of a decision he made carelessly. He said I looked incredible. I thanked him. He said he was glad I had come. I told him it was a beautiful venue. He looked down at his shoes for a moment and then looked back up and said, "Nadia, I made a terrible mistake." I waited. He said, "I think about you all the time." I said, "I know. That is why you keep looking at me." He blinked. I said, "Marcus, you did not make a mistake. You made a choice. You chose correctly for who you are. The mistake you're feeling right now is not about me. It is about the fact that you are realizing, in real time, that the life you chose is not the life you would have had. That is not my problem. That is just consequences." He opened his mouth. Then Enzo Marcello appeared beside me with 2 glasses of champagne and looked at Marcus with the same cool, unhurried assessment he had given the man at the Callaway Club bar. Not hostile, simply absolute, and said, "Is there something you needed?" Marcus shook his head. He walked away. He did not come back. The evening ended with a reveal that I had not planned, but had perhaps, in some part of myself I did not examine too closely, hoped for. Enzo Marcello's right-hand man, a quiet figure named Cassius, who had been at the back of the ballroom all evening with the patience of a man who is paid to wait, approached the table at 9:45 and placed a small tablet in Enzo Marcello's hands. He looked at it. He looked at me. He said, "This may interest you." I looked. It was a document. Financial records, specifically, a string of wire transfers from an account in Marcus Hale's name at Alderman Financial to a holding company registered in a name I did not recognize, totaling $312,000 over the past 14 months. The date of the first transfer was 6 weeks after Marcus and I had gotten engaged. The date of the last was 4 months ago. I had spent 8 months at Alderman Financial as a consultant 3 years ago. I knew those account structures. I knew what they meant. I looked at Enzo Marcello and said, "This is embezzlement." He said, "The compliance department at Alderman will receive it Monday morning." The SEC will receive it Tuesday. I asked him why he had it. He looked at me with those calm, certain eyes and said, "Because people who disrespect what is mine have a habit of having other things to answer for." I sat with that sentence for a long moment, feeling its weight settle into me like the last piece of something that had been incomplete. Then I picked up my champagne and I finished it, and I set the glass down and I said, "I'd like to leave now." He stood immediately. He offered his arm, and I walked out of the Ashworth Grand Hotel in my Ferrante e Brio gown on the arm of the Iron Sovereign. And behind me, I heard the whisper of my skirt on the marble floor, and I felt, for the first time in a very long time, like the full, exact, unedited version of myself. Not a smaller version, not a quieter version, not a version calibrated for someone else's comfort. Just me, at last, just entirely, unapologetically me. 3 weeks later, Marcus Hale was placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation at Alderman Financial. His legal fees, Priya told me, were already at $60,000 and climbing. Camille called me on a Sunday morning. I let it go to voicemail. I was at Sable, at a window table with a view of the harbor, eating eggs and bread and something wonderful with cream. And across the table, Enzo Marcello was reading a brief and drinking his coffee and not requiring anything from me except my presence, which he treated as a privilege and not a condition. He looked up and found me looking at him and said, "What?" I said nothing. He said, "Nadia, tell me." So I told him what I had been thinking, which was that I had spent so many years being grateful to be chosen that I had forgotten I was also capable of choosing. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over mine and said, "You were always choosing. You were just choosing badly." I laughed. He did not laugh, but the corner of his mouth moved in a way I had learned to read, in the weeks since the wedding, as the equivalent. I turned my hand over under his and I held it. Outside, the harbor was bright and indifferent and going about its business. And I thought, this is the beginning. Not the end of something. The beginning. Everything that came before. The 7 years, the 17 pounds, the Thursday evening in March, the peonies I had chosen for a wedding that was never going to be mine. All of it was the world making room. Making room for a woman who would not be erased. Making room for a woman who would show up in emerald silk and Colombian emeralds and let the room adjust to her. I did not need Marcus's regret. I did not need Camille's apology, though I suspected it would come eventually. In a long handwritten letter, she would spend weeks composing, and I would read exactly once. What I needed, I had already found. I had found it in a mirror on a September morning. I had found it in a bar where a dangerous man looked at someone who had dismissed me and said, "Apologize." I had found it in the whisper of a 3-inch train on a marble floor, and in the warm, unhurried weight of a hand placed over mine at a harbor window, asking nothing. If you are still watching this, and I hope you are, because you deserve the ending, I need you to know that the best part of this story is not the look on Marcus's face when those doors opened. The best part is what happened in my kitchen on the morning of the 22nd, when I stood in my own studio in a gown built for exactly my body, and I looked in that mirror, and I recognized myself. That is the moment I want for you. Not the revenge, though the revenge was spectacular, and I will not pretend otherwise, but the recognition. The moment you see yourself clearly, in all your actual dimensions, and understand that the people who asked you to be smaller were the ones with the limited imagination, not you. You were always the diamond. They just never learned to look. If this story hit you somewhere real, please give it a like. It genuinely means the world and helps this channel reach the people who need it. Share it with someone who is in the middle of their own Thursday evening in March and needs to know there is an emerald gown waiting on the other side. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and hit that notification bell, because I promise you, you do not want to miss what comes next. And leave me a comment. What would you have said to Marcus in that hallway? Because I know exactly what you would have said, and I think you are magnificent for it.